Welcome to the Theology in Motion podcast. Join us for conversations about the theology of worship, its practice, culture, and design. The Theology in Motion podcast is by the Center for Worship Leadership, Christ College, Concordia University, Irvine in California.
Welcome to Theology in Motion. My name is Steve Zank, and on behalf of the Center for Worship Leadership, we're glad that you are here. Today, I am honored to sit down with two liturgical scholars, Dr. Kent Burreson and Dr. Rhoda Schuler, and talk about their latest collaboration, a Calvin Institute in Christian Worship funded research project. They've done field research on what they call the adult catechumenate, and we're going to get into that terminology in a second. And the research is in the Lutheran Church, but the implications of the survey go far beyond denominational barriers. They've been offering workshops that help pastors and congregations envision an adult catechumenal model that's a discipleship kind of model involving catechetical teaching. And that could transform congregations and rooted in some of the church's most ancient practices. One of these workshops is still coming up in June, and I'll include a link for you guys for registration in the show notes. Some pretty interesting stuff. On today's introductions, Dr. Rhoda Schuler is here, Professor Emeritus and Scholar in Residence at Concordia University, St. Paul, where she has taught full-time since 2008. From 2009 to 2018, Rhoda was the Assistant Director of the Honors Program in Faith and Learning, lead teacher for the honors courses in the spring semester. But her research passions are liturgical theology, ritual studies, and she has a THD in historical theology from Luther Seminary and an MA in liturgical studies from St. John's University School of Theology. She serves as a liturgist at her congregation there at St. Paul, the author of articles like Luther, the Lord's Prayer, and Luther's Liturgical Reform. She authored the entry on confirmation in an Encyclopedia of Protestantism. Rhoda has been a member of the North American Academy of Liturgy for over 20 years. Rhoda, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for being on the show.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks.
And we also have Dr. Kent Burreson, who's Rhoda's partner in this work on the catechumenate. He's the Louis A. Finke and Anna B. Shine Professor of Systematic Theology at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, a seminary faculty member since 2000. He's an associate professor of systematic theology and the dean of the chapel of St. Timothy and St. Titus. He teaches courses on confessions, systematics, religious bodies, Byzantine theology, and many different courses on worship. He was a member of the liturgy subcommittee of the Lutheran Hymnal Project that prepared the Lutheran Service Book, the LSB, in use at many Lutheran churches today. He holds a Master's of Divinity and a Master of Sacred Theology from Concordia Seminary, and a Master of Arts and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Notre Dame. He engages in research on the history of Reformation and post-Reformation worship, worship and culture, worship as ritual performance, and the theology of worship. He is currently engaged in 2 projects, researching, writing, and providing resources. One is on natural burial. The other we're discussing today here on the show with Rhoda. And actually, I should mention, he's on sabbatical doing a 3rd project on the theology of practice of worship in Luther. So we're really excited to see what comes of that work. You can find some of his writing on the matter of natural burial in a book recently released, authored with Dr. Beth Holtke, Death, Heaven, Resurrection, and the New Creation. I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. Kent, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Steve.
So I've got you here. Let's talk about your research project that you're doing. Talks about what the catechumenate, what that is, and what was the genesis of this project? What got you thinking about it?
So this project actually had its wings, sort of, or initial wings, back about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I had conversations with one of the pastors that is involved in our project today, along with Concordia Publishing House, about developing materials and resources for the catechumenate. Nothing ever came of that, but as a result of that initial initiative and my interest in the catechumenate that was born when I was a PhD student in Notre Dame, I knew that I wanted to do work on the catechumenate and the process of faith formation at some point in the future. And when I became aware of the opportunity to potentially apply for some grant money that would fund a project of this type. I, along with Rhoda, have been a member of the North American Academy of Liturgy for over 20 years and have known Rhoda for 15 of those, 16, 17, something like that. And so I approached her at NAL, 4 years ago, I guess, something like that, and said, do you want to work on this? I have a project in mind. I'd like to apply for grant money. Do you want to work on this with me? And she said yes, for which I was very glad.
Yeah. Great opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And so we applied for a Lilly grant initially. It's very competitive, and we did not receive the Lilly grant.
It was Louisville.
Louisville. Sorry, I said Lilly. They're funded by Lilly too.
Okay.
Louisville, everybody's funded by Lilly.
That seems like it.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? A Louisville grant, and very competitive, and we didn't receive one. And then the next year, when we were explaining at NAL, actually, our process of applying for that Louisville grant, John Whitvliet, who is the director of the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, was at NAL that year. He usually is. And he heard our presentation, and in the hallway, honestly, as the conference was coming to an end, he passed me by and said, "Hey, Kent, you should apply for one of our grants.
Great.
You should do it now."
Yeah.
And like right that minute.
Yeah. Which we did not do. Yeah.
We waited a year.
It took us another year.
We waited a year and then applied, and then received what at the time they only had one grant program, which was supporting engagement with worship in congregational life. So we designed the project both to have a research component, which really wasn't a part of their, because that was our original Louisville grant. Research component really wasn't a part of their grant design, but they were accepting of that. And then a corporate element, which was to resource congregations by our research. So researching for congregations. Yeah. And then resourcing other congregations that wanted to pursue the catechumenate. And then once we finished that grant, then over a year ago, we applied for a second because they had developed a new grant program, which is more focused on research.
That's awesome.
So, but our current grant has also a congregational component as well. So it's sort of a mixed element thing too. So this is now a grant from Calvin Institute of Christian Worship 2 years in a row. So
that's great.
I want to add to that.
And I would just say that the first one went in under Kent's name, and that one had expected there to be an assistant project director, which was the role that I did. And then because a lot of places they don't let you come back and get a grant year after year. So the second one then was submitted in my name and is administered by my institution.
Yeah.
But
that's great. So, I'm so happy that this topic was selected and that you guys are running the process here. Let's get into the details a little bit. Catechumenate might be a word that some listeners aren't familiar with. Can you walk us through what's going on when we talk about a catechumenate? What are we talking about?
Before we get into that, can I mention one thing?
Of course,
Steve, that I didn't mention. The Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, the grant program, is something that congregations can apply for. So I just want to make sure that we get this into the podcast for people, because they fund about 45, something like that, grants a year in the congregational worship category of the grant program. So you can have congregations from across the spectrum in terms of denominational background apply for these grants, and they can be things like developing prayer life in the congregation, or developing a catechetical program, or increasing the use of hymnody in the congregation. I mean, there's just a whole variety of things that can be done. So I'd encourage people to check out the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, their website, and the grant program there, because it can be a great blessing to a congregation. So
yeah, and in some ways, maybe even the church at large, if your research produces fruit that's compatible to other churches, that could be really helpful. Yeah, thanks for encouraging that. Yeah.
Exactly. So catechumenate, you were asking about.
Yeah.
what we're talking about.
Yeah. For those who might not be familiar with the term, what are we talking about?
The word it's one of those ancient words. We talked about this prior to the recording, that this is a practice rooted in the early church. And so the terminology comes from that. Probably your listeners would be most familiar if they went through a confirmation instruction. They would have been called a catechumen, at least in our rights, in our written rights. That's the terminology we use. And it is, well, as we've kind of switched over to different language of talking about faith formation. And our research is specifically in the area of adult faith formation, or the adult catechumenate. And it follows a pattern of the early church. And I'm going to pass the baton back to Kent, because I might get those 4 stages mixed up. Why don't you talk about the 4 stages?
Yeah, so you have, there's different terminology used, but you have the period of inquiry, which is basically sort of a seeker moment, to use that kind of terminology. So it's people that are, well, what's Christianity about, and what's the nature of Christian life and the church and that kind of thing. So it's a period that can be for an extended period of time. People can be in this period of inquiry for a lengthy period or a short period, depending upon their own background and interests. But it's an opportunity in which the church sort of lays out essentially, well, who is Jesus and who is God, and let's look at the Bible. And you're not familiar with the Bible, so what is the Bible? That's sort of the period of inquiry, and then that leads into the catechumenate. So you are enrolled in the catechumenate, and what that means is now it's a more intensive study. You're coming to understand, well, what does it mean to pray? What does it look like to pray? How do I pray? What kinds of behaviors flow from the Christian life, and what does the Christian life look like? What does the church look like? How do we behave in the church? How do we gather for worship? Who is God, but a more in-depth look at who is God through the scriptures, and especially focusing on the Gospels and the primary narrative. So that's the period of catechumenate, and usually in most congregations that will run from, let's say, September until Lent, the first Sunday in Lent.
So it really is a kind of period of initiation, in a way, into what it means to be, what your identity of Christ is, and what it means to be in community of the church. But it's not meant to be conceived of as a lifelong discipleship, but it's meant to be a period of initiation into helping someone who doesn't really know what's going on into understanding what is.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it's a beginning of that.
Yeah.
The catechumenate is trying to shape, through these 4 periods, is trying to shape a lifelong discipleship. But it is the initiatory period. It's the entrance into that kind of pattern. And then the 3rd period is the period of enlightenment, which is the intensive, focused preparation for baptism. So that usually begins on Lent 1, and then baptisms are conducted or led usually in the adult catechumenate on during Easter at the Easter Vigil. So this is a period of 7 weeks approximately of intensive kind of preparation for baptism. And so people can go through the catechumenate numerous times and not make the sort of final step, crossing the threshold into baptism. It might take one time, but it might take 3 times, going through the catechumenate, and then they're ready to make that kind of commitment to be baptized.
And I would just add here that going through it more than once is a part of what we saw in our research in these 4 congregations, that was the case. And so often, primarily, people go through it one time, but there are those who are just not yet ready.
Can we pause there for a second and explore that just for a quick minute here? What are some of the reasons people gave in the study for not wanting to be baptized after they've been through the catechumenate?
Each different case was unique. In some cases, it was family. You may have. So, for instance, one of our congregations, probably true in some of the others too, but it's a very diverse, rich area. This is in the Bronx, New York. And so, you have the pastor there indicated that you have people coming to their church, but maybe their parents, are members at another church just down the street, a long historic association with that congregation. So there's a hesitancy to make that switch that might cause discord and within the family. So that's one issue. Rhoda, can you think of some others? I know there are.
Yeah, I'm recalling the story that Tim just told at a conference from 2 weeks ago and this was on a doctrinal point, a man who just could not come along when it came to the Lutheran understanding of the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. And I think that was a third time for this guy. And finally at one, I think it was 4. Okay. Finally, at one of the teaching sessions that the pastor was having, and he's running through it again, and the guy's heart was convicted that the Lutheran position was correct. And Christ is really present, and he said, "You know what this means?" And the guy says, "Yes, it means I'm Lutheran."
There are. I think of an example of there was in one of the congregations, a lady whose daughter had become a member of the congregation, and she had witnessed to the life of the congregation to her mother, but it took a long time to get her mother to even come to the church. But then when she finally did, she was interested. She joined the catechumenate, but then life circumstances got in the way, and job changes and all that kind of stuff. So that's another reason, shifts in terms of the contours of life. Yeah, that she went through the catechumenate, wasn't ready to enroll for baptism, so then went through it again. That kind of thing. So there are a lot of variety of different reasons.
You're really drawing my mind into this idea that in your research, baptism isn't just a ritual or rite between God and the person being baptized, but there's a really important, actually maybe overlooked sometimes, horizontal component to baptism among the people of the community of faith there. Is that an important feature that you found in your research?
Absolutely. That a big part of what we've seen in these successful adult faith formation processes is that it is also an initiation into the community of faith. Mm. Yes, in baptism, we are joined to Christ in his death and resurrection, but that is a communal thing. Mm-hmm. And, the body of Christ today in the world is the church. And so absolutely, to become connected to Christ's body here in the form of the church is absolutely essential for the idea of lifelong discipleship.
And if I can add to that, so one of the resources that we've used in our workshops is a book by Alan Kreider that explores the conversion process, essentially, why so many people became Christian in the first 5. Well, it goes through about the first 6 centuries. Yeah. And there are 3 factors that he says are central. And we saw all of these play out in our congregations. So belief, belonging, and behavior. And in some ways, the belonging and the behavior precede the belief. They're sort of mixed together. You can't separate them out. But so that belonging issue and that behavior issue are central to that horizontal dimension you were talking about, Steve, within baptism and within the conversion process in the catechumenate. So that, building all of the congregations have some way of building relationship within the catechumenate, whether that's through sponsors, whether that's through friends that come along with them on the journey, whether that's through prayer partners, whatever it is. And some of those relationships already exist, where they know somebody as a part of that particular Christian community. Eating is central. This is part of our research. Eating is central to all the congregations' catechumenates. In other words, almost all the congregations don't do anything without eating together.
Amazing.
Which is why we're all in this kind of holding pattern right now, since eating and singing and all the things that build community are so restricted in the pandemic.
Yeah, so that belonging issue is critical.
And I know, Kent, I interrupted you a while back on the 4 stages So I know that we still want to get to the fourth stage, but
Sure.
let's just to keep our listeners in suspense a little bit longer. It seems like as we talk about this and just singing and eating and gathering, as you think about the way in which we're talking about mainly adults, right? People who are being led into a process, they're interested, they're being taught, and they're being led into baptism, being part of the community. And as you said, Rhoda, echoing Romans, that they're buried with Christ in baptism and raised with him. As you talk about this process, what role did the worship gathering itself play, or certain rituals that are in the life of the church? How did you see those connecting to these stages?
In each of again, we looked at 4 in depth, the original grant. We looked at 4 congregations that had a robust adult catechumenate. And in all of them, the Sunday worship of the congregation was central. And there were other ways in which ritual also informed these, moving through these different stages in some of the congregations. For instance, Kent just mentioned the church in the Bronx. It was one of the ones that he studied. I did one in suburban Chicago. And the structure for the courses, for the weekly classes in the adult catechumenate, he just follows the lectionary. He said, we start with the invocation, and there you are talking about the Trinity, talking about God, and then they move to confession and absolution. So they're very bound up. All of them are bound up. The teaching, the catechetical part, is bound up with the liturgy. In the case of the church in Georgia, I think I would say there that he uses a 1-year lectionary, and that is then that those Sunday gospel lessons are the basis for the weekly teaching as well. So there's a strong integration between the teaching side of it and the Sunday worship life.
And I'll just add, with regard to congregational life, there's no question. I mentioned the eating together, that's fundamental to the catechumenal program, the catechumenal process at all these congregations. But all these congregations have more than one worship service a week. So they all have multiple worship services midweek. One of the congregations has a daily Lord's Supper service, except for one day, Monday. That's the Chicago congregation. One in New York has daily worship every day. Wow. I think pretty much in some form. And then the one in Georgia has Wednesday, Sunday, and I think maybe one other day at least. So you're doing multiple opportunities for gathering, and they usually link up their catechetical classes for adults and often for youth with one of those worship services, so that there's an opportunity to gather as the Christian community, then often a meal associated obviously with that, and then the class or the meal and the class go together, the different patterns. But that's sort of central to the whole understanding of the catechumenate. It is a task of the entire congregation for these congregations, that they are all incorporating these new people into their midst, into their body. Yeah, especially in now we're recording this episode in January 2021, how wonderful that might seem to us to gather, to sing, to eat, to teach. And I wanted to mention the website associated with this research and thinking is called forminglutherans.org, and it's called Lutherans because you guys are Lutheran scholars. You did work in Lutheran congregations, but it's not meant to say this is the only way that it happens in Lutheranism or something. But I wanted to go back to something Rhoda said about this idea of it being formational. Forming Lutherans is formational. I was having a conversation last night actually about prayer, and sometimes in some traditions, prayer is seen as valuable insofar as it's extemporaneous or something. That if prayer is from the heart and in the moment, that gives it value. And I think that there's a way in which that must be true. But there's also another way of thinking that when I learned to pray over meal times, I would pray, "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, let these gifts to us be blessed." Or I live with a German
a couple for a few years in which we prayed in German, Komm her, Jesus, sei du unser Gast und segne uns und was du uns als Liebe und Gnade beschert hast. But there's a way in which those, can you believe that stuck in my head? I don't know German that well, but that stuck in my head. And I say all this to ask the question. What I hear you saying is these folks who are going through the catechumenal process, they're not just being invited into a congregation, into an extemporaneous worship setting, but you're saying they were tied to a lot of different traditions, including a lectionary series where they would be welcomed into a series of way of reading the Bible. They're welcomed into a kind of a set liturgy with, I'm sure, some flexibility, but hey, we do an invocation here. Here's why we do it. We do the Lord's Supper here at the service. Here's why we do that. And it seems like one thing that I'm really drawing personally from thinking about this with you and your research is the foundational aspect of consistent ritual that's meaningful, that you can invite someone into. Can you talk a little bit about that feature of your research?
Yeah, I'll talk about the church in suburban Chicago. Mm-hmm. Part of our first grant was we interviewed the pastors, of course, and other staff, but we also did interviews with people who were going through or had recently gone through the adult catechumenal process. Mm-hmm. And so many of the people that I interviewed that were part of this congregation, I hesitate to use the term high church, but I don't have a better one, but a very strongly liturgical way of doing things.
Like from a prayer book maybe or something, like they're going off of a template.
Not just the words spoken, but also just the care with which the liturgy was presided over.
Sure.
And it was striking the number of people who came from either a Roman Catholic or Episcopal background where they had that familiarity with the liturgy. But I did interview, I remember well, the one person that I interviewed who came out of a free church, American evangelical background, and that was very foreign to her. Mm-hmm. And precisely for some of the things that you just mentioned, that, if you grow up in that tradition, a more authentic prayer is one which comes from the heart.
Right.
But she spoke eloquently about learning to appreciate the regularity of the liturgy, of the deep theology that was associated with it, and clearly had fully embraced that and recognized its value. I'm recalling now what one of my mentors from my undergraduate days said when his father died, and he said to his children, "This is why we go to church every Sunday, so that we know what to say in these moments when we have no words."
Yeah, I think there's a lot of benefit to that repetition, the congregation, but sometimes the repetition maybe comes from places you wouldn't necessarily expect. So in the Bronx, one of the things that stuck with me, and I can still sing it, they have a song refrain that they use, punctuating all the rites of the catechumenate and associated with each individual catechumen. So when they brought them forward for the rite of enrollment into the catechumenate, when they brought them forward for the rite of election, which is entering into the period of enlightenment that I talked about, all those particular times, they bring them up individually. So there's a focus on the individual within the community. Every time they brought one of the individuals up publicly for whatever they were going to do ritually, they sang the song. So it's getting repeated throughout the entire catechumenate by the entire congregation. And that just musically for me, it gets in my head. So I can still sing it right now. I was only there twice, all of Holy Week, but I can still sing it. They were hearing it numerous times throughout the stretch and experience. And we didn't go back to visit those we saw baptized a year later. That would be another grant. But if we had, it would be interesting to ask the question, do you remember? And I didn't know to ask that question when we were doing the interviews 2 years ago. Do you remember the song that, and my guess is, this is a guess, so this isn't research. My guess is, though, that they could probably start singing it or at least recite words and the pastor uses a different song each year.
Wow.
Just thematically to represent what's going on. So, and in this case, the year that when I did the research at the congregation in the Bronx, it was an African song, a tune out of Christianity in Africa. So it's very effective. So it's just an example of the repetition that maybe isn't, you wouldn't associate traditionally. You won't find it in any of the hymn books.
Right.
In the sense of the song you might, but not how they used it. So that's sort of extemporaneous, but yet with a repetition that's designed throughout the whole period.
And I want to then talk about ritual in kind of a different way, completely different way from the Chicago, suburban Chicago church, where they did not mark those transition times in the formation process in any kind of public ritual way. In that congregation, it was, and the context is everything. That's one of our major research findings, that you're just in a different context. It's going to be done differently. And in the case of the suburban Chicago one, this was a matter of pastoral care, that, the people had been coming to the classes, and now it's time to decide, are you going to go on? And most of the people are already baptized, but are you going to, go on to recommit? And that's a private conversation. And there's nothing public. But what I discovered in interviewing, the first person I interviewed, I don't remember what question I asked, but he started talking about the Holy Thursday service, because they do a stripping of the altar, which is, traditional in liturgical churches, stripping of the altar at the end of the Maundy Thursday service. And the people who are being baptized or being confirmed or reaffirmed, whatever you call it, on Easter Vigil are invited to participate in that particular ritual. And you come and rehearse, and everybody, is involved in carrying things out or washing the altar. And he talked about that particular annual once-a-year ritual and his participation in that in a very personal way is extremely meaningful. And then I had another person also spontaneously mention that. So then I started asking about it. And that is what people remembered. We had all kinds of questions about, how do you experience the ritual at the Easter Vigil? The people I interviewed at this suburban Chicago church could tell me practically nothing.
Yeah.
They remembered practically nothing. Oh, I don't know. We stood around the font, and I think we all got asked questions, and they did the youth first, and but they could all tell me about the party afterwards.
Yeah.
Especially the evangelical woman, when they rolled out the kegs of beer and brought out the bottles of wine. She could. So ritual can impact us in different ways. There can be that repetitive thing that comes deep in our bones, and that can be that extraordinary moment where I wish I could remember what that older gentleman, how he described it, but it very much solidified for him what Christ's sacrifice on the cross meant.
No, thank you so much. The power of ritual. I mean, it's not just the content, as if it didn't come to you through of a certain means or vessel. I think maybe we should give Kent back the floor regarding the 4 stages.
Go for it.
Would you mind just doing a brief summary of the first 3 to get us going again?
Sure. So we have the period of inquiry, which is exploring the period of enrollment in the Catechumenate, which is a more in-depth study of the nature of the Christian life and who God is and Christ and the gospel. And then the period of enlightenment, which is the period of preparation for baptism, very intensive preparation. And then the one that we didn't get to, which is the post-baptismal period, called in the early church, and still the term that's used in most cases, mystagogy, which is simply, of course, the Greek word for sacrament, I mean, that's sacrament is the derived Latin term, sacramentum, from mystagogy. So this is the period in the early church where they would have unpacked what happened at your baptism, what happened the night you were baptized, what took place, what was water was applied in the name of the triune God, oil was applied after you were baptized, you participated in the Lord's Supper. What does all this mean in light of the story that we have been talking about over the past, 8 months, 7 months, 6 months, whatever it is. And so it was a period of unpacking that, and then also a period for engagement. Okay, how do you now live in light of this story that you have been brought to participation in? And now that you're part of this Christian community, what does the Christian life look like? And honestly, a lot of congregations, this is probably the period that they struggle the most with in terms of what do we do with this period? How do we engage the people that have gone through their baptisms or confirmations or reaffirmations of faith? How do we engage them now in lifelong discipleship and understanding that? And so I think a lot of congregations struggle with that period, but that's the final period.
Is this period the period of mystagogy, unpacking the sacramental life? Is this then have no end expiration date? That you go through the first three, but then you land and remain in the fourth stage. Is that the way it?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So it is the sort of final period of preparation for lifelong discipleship. So you're in that stage. You're not unpacking your baptismal experience. In a sense you are, but not intensively in a focused class. But yes, although it's interesting in our research, in many of the congregations, people will go back through the catechumenate who have been baptized or confirmed. They'll go back through it again. That's part of their understanding of lifelong discipleship. They may go back through it in a number of different ways. They may go back through it just individually to participate in it because they want more, they want to give attention to what they heard a second time or a third time. They may go back through it as a sponsor of somebody who is participating in the process now. They may go back through it in terms of assisting with the congregation's process. So there are a variety of ways in which they can go back through it. A lot of people will go back through it even after they've been baptized or been confirmed.
But they won't be baptized a second time, most likely.
No. In this case, they would just reaffirm their baptism.
Yeah. So it sounds like, as we're talking about this, there's a quote from Tish Warren that I like from her book, The Liturgy of the Ordinary, where she talks about the liturgy quietly, even forgettably feeding her. And then you can contrast that with these first, maybe that's the fourth stage. Maybe that's why it's so hard for people to work through that stage. It's a little less momentous. And these other three stages you're talking about for the person who's interested and then goes through training towards baptism and the involvement in the community for all that means, the Christian community, is a very momentous occasion. Can we talk about that dynamic a little bit? How do we think about that dynamic? It might not be just the dynamic of baptism and the life of the Christian or something, but I imagine anyone could think about times in which their worship experience was quite momentous and other times where it seemed forgettable, if that's a word I can use without getting in trouble.
The only thing that comes to my mind is the comment that Scott made in response to the power of the liturgy to kind of quietly do this work. He said, I can preach a bad sermon. That's a possibility. He said, but I can't preside over a bad liturgy. That there's a power in the liturgy that is beyond the capabilities of a pastor who, may hit a home run at lots of Sundays with his preaching, but that's a daunting task week after week. And sometimes you don't have the time or it just doesn't come together, but you can always rely on the gospel being presented through the liturgy.
I think of one of the people that I met. I didn't actually interview her as part of the research, but at one of the congregations, and she's a lifelong Lutheran. So she's been a member of a Lutheran congregation for a long time. She had gone through their catechumenate in the Bronx years ago. She's a Lutheran school teacher. So, she has a strong familiarity with Lutheran practice. But she went through the catechumenate just because this congregation encourages everyone who's joining the congregation, coming from another Lutheran congregation, let's say, even though they're already baptized and confirmed, to go through the catechumenate because of that connection to the community. So how do you learn the community's way of life? Well, you learn it through walking through the catechumenate, which is how everybody enters into our community's life. So she did that. And she had done it years ago, and then she served as a sponsor numerous times. And while I was there was an issue that blew up at the Lutheran school where she teaches. She was concerned with how it was being handled. She felt like the first response should be prayer. So she came to her pastor because the school is not a part of this congregation. And she said, "This is not the way of life that we've learned here. This is not how I understand we should be responding to this issue." And basically what she was saying is this is sort of the forgetful parts, sort of resurfacing, or the formation that you're not even aware of. It was reflected in her comments that she felt that the first thing they should be doing, which she then went and did when her pastor reaffirmed her and said, yeah, that should be the first response when you're battling evil. You battle it in such a way with the weapons of the Spirit, and the primary weapon of the Spirit is prayer. And this is the way you've learned here in our midst. So that would be an example, I think, of that kind of reflection. It's also manifest in the responses that people gave when we interviewed them. Because often it was not the big things, ritual things. When we asked them questions about, well, what was the most formative thing, or what was the primary experience that you had, or what do you remember?
Yeah.
And often it was not the things that I, as a liturgist, would often say, oh, that's the big thing.
Yeah.
It was other things that were part of the process, but they're sort of the more subtle, hidden things. Sometimes it was the big thing. Whether it was the baptism itself, or the enrollment in one of the congregations, you sign a book publicly in the congregation. Sometimes it was that, but in a lot of cases it was, my sponsor called me on Sunday before my baptism, or on the Sunday preceding my baptism the next weekend, just to strengthen me and affirm me and pray with me. Well, that's not even a part of it is part of the liturgy, so to speak, a liturgy of life, but it's not part of the liturgical ritual structure. But that was the thing that the person remembered, or that was the thing that they highlighted as most critical and essential. So I think that both of those examples would speak to the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of the high mountaintop experiences versus the more forgetful kind of things.
It sounds like we're drawing out, at least what's coming out of me as we discuss this material, I had the opportunity to engage it again, is that the little ways maybe even our rituals are shaping us. And maybe it's a renewed call for us to be aware, at least, of our decisions. And we're not just picking an opening song and then picking a closing song, and then maybe some kind of segue between them in a modern setting. But there's a meaning behind what we're doing. And maybe what I hear is a call to pay attention to that dynamic.
Yeah, there's absolutely no question that congregational design of ritual, all of our congregations participate in that kind of congregational design. And that's why the high points, or the mountaintop experiences kinds of things, are important, and they're formative, even if people aren't reflecting on them. But then there's also, and that's sort of the communal dimension. It brings about the communal dimension. I'm joining this community. We've all gone through these rituals. We've walked this path together. But then there's also that, what we were talking about with those forgetful kinds of experiences, people reflecting upon the things that, as I indicated earlier, that are more meaningful to them, that in some ways we don't have any control over. They're just part of the liturgical process. They're part of the formative process. And we don't have any control over them. And that's okay. God has control over them, which is fine. God's in control through Christ by the Spirit of all of this stuff. And so there's a mix of those two things working together to form people. So, giving attention both to the corporate realities, the mountaintop experiences, but then also giving attention to and nurturing the opportunity for people to enter into them, to be formed by them in whatever individual way that is meaningful to them and that will allow them to connect what they've experienced with their own individual lives. I mean, that's part of the nurturing part of the process for pastor, for those involved in the catechumenal process, what's catechetical director, the sponsors, friends walking along with them, prayer partners. That's part of their role, is to nurture those kinds of experiences so that the individual can participate in it and derive meaning from it and orient their lives around what they've experienced. And that's one of the things that I'm reflecting right now. We haven't developed our research in such a way that we've published it at this point. We'd like to at some point. So, but one of the things that we should give attention to is the role of the pastor or those involved in the process as curators. I mean, they're curating the experience in that regard, and how they do that. And they each of them do it in different ways, but there's an attention. Rhoda referred to it earlier as a care for the liturgy and a care for the experience, a care for the catechumenate, and that's what their care for it allows those kinds of experiences to surface for people as they walk through it.
As you talk about meaning in experiencing maybe a ritual, or a part of the liturgy, a part of a liturgy. Would you mind if I asked you a meaningful part in worship that you've experienced, a ritual that you find connected meaning to? Would you mind sharing an example of that for yourselves?
Well, this is an oddball one. Mm-hmm. It's a pandemic-related one. We last March, we just suddenly couldn't go to church, couldn't sing, which is still one of the hardest things for me. Yeah. And I'm a liturgical junkie, and so Holy Week is like the biggest high of all. I have sometimes done the ending to that Holy Thursday service as the altar is being stripped, where Psalm 22 is single voice chanting a cappella. And I've done that numerous times. I'm old. I've done it a lot of times, and sometimes I share it with others because I can try to be generous. But this particular year, this 2020, we were recording services, and I went over to my church, which has fabulous acoustics, with my laptop, with a nice microphone, and I recorded it standing behind the altar alone. And it, Christ prayed that psalm alone. That was a powerful experience for me.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, we could probably, both of us, all three of us indicate, the numerous kinds of experiences. But I'll talk about one in relationship to the catechumenate in our research. So one of the rites that can be done on Maundy, Thursday is the rite of foot washing. And there are different ways of doing the rite of foot washing, but at the congregation in the Bronx, the pastor washes the feet of all the catechumens. So publicly, as part of the ritual in the congregation. And I have led a foot washing rite. I did that in my congregation that I served in Indiana. I've also participated in them in other contexts. So I've participated in foot washing rites, and they've always been meaningful to me. They've always had a certain formative power for me in terms of the nature of Christian service and servanthood. But in this case, the pastor invited me as the researcher who was there participating in the congregation's rites to be one of the people that had their feet washed. And that was an incredibly powerful experience to be associated as a researcher with these catechumens who were walking through this experience, who I was interviewing and talking to be incorporated as part of them in this congregation's life. So, I mean, honestly, for me, I didn't journey through the whole catechumenate, but I did journey through significant portions of it. I felt like I had become a member of that congregation. And so I said afterward to the pastor there, I said, well, you now have you should have an associate member category, because I would be the first immediate associate member of your congregation. And I sort of consider myself that in a certain way. And a lot of it was participating in that foot washing rite, and being associated with the catechumens. That was powerful.
Yeah, it's amazing the ways that as you're describing this, the ways in which our rituals can bind us together as a community in the way that they do bring us together. Well, we're getting near the end here. Are there any other kind of closing remarks or things you wanted us to get to that we hadn't yet got a chance to? Have a closing question, but before we get there, anything on your mind?
One thing I would mention is that in terms of the practical implementation of the catechumenate in congregations, I mean, that's part of what we're doing with this current grant, is trying to promote through workshops congregations using aspects of the catechumenal process. And I would still contend, on a basis of our research, I already had this conviction before, which is, sort of a prejudiced position, but any researcher comes in with prejudiced positions. But I'm even as more thoroughly convinced of it afterward, that aspects of the catechumenate is not a program. And so you don't want to think about it as a program, but it's a process. And so there are parts of the process that any congregation can use depending upon their context. And I'm still convinced that that's the case. So we're working, Rhoda in particular is working right now with a couple of congregations that are in more rural settings. We didn't have any congregations as part of our research that were in primarily a rural setting. And so I'm convinced that, the catechumenate, you can't copy it. You can't copy what's done in the Bronx or what's done in Chicago, whatever. But there are resources and there are things that you can use in your context that would be helpful. And this crosses the liturgical spectrum too. This crosses whether you're high ritual or low ritual, whether you follow a hymnal or don't follow a hymnal specifically. But I think the catechumenate is a process for making disciples. And so there are things in the process that can be used in any congregation, in any context. It's a matter of discernment in terms of, what things should we use in our context and what things will be helpful in terms of forming and shaping disciples where we're at. So,
and to piggyback on that, in terms of what I'm trying to do with these couple of rural congregations is we're talking about areas where they have a much more stable population. And so it's not so much, drawing in new people, but deepening the sense of discipleship for the whole congregation. That growth in a church is not necessarily numerical.
If this conversation has piqued your interest, you can sign up for the upcoming workshop in June with Kent and Rhoda and the research churches through forminglutherans.org. Kent and Rhoda, again, thank you so much for joining me today. I want to close with a question I've asked many guests before, and I found it to become an encouraging question to people. There is a road upon which everyone involved in leadership of worship travels to their churches on Sunday morning. There's only one of this road somehow. It's a mystical experience. But there's a billboard on that road that I'm actually giving you control of. I'm asking, what do you want those people on their way in?
Oh, I am recalling what I have seen carved inside a pulpit. Sir, we wish to see Jesus. I believe that's from the Gospel of John.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I'm going to use one of the statements that one of the catechumens that we interviewed said about the impact of the catechumenate, and so the impact of worship in general, and so that those leaders would know in the times when they doubt that what they're laboring for is even worth it. Trust me, it is. And what she said was, as a result of this process, I've realized that I am a disciple of Christ. I pray all the time. I worship all the time. I'm a Christian all the time. And that was her response. And that's what the worship life of this congregation, the catechumenate, did to her. So that's what these leaders are aiming toward as they journey toward worship.
Wow. Thank you both for the encouragement today. Appreciate all the work you're doing. Kent, we'll be looking forward to seeing your sabbatical work come to fruition. And Rhoda, Kent, looking forward to seeing this work you've been doing someday, maybe published in a journal or something. We'll be looking for that. Looking forward to reading more about your final conclusions. And again, thank you so much for joining me today. And again, it's a great honor to be with you.
Likewise.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Theology in Motion with Drs. Rhoda Schuler and Kent Burreson on their research with forming Lutherans. Next month, Dr. Lester Ruth is in the house. We're discussing the history of the modern worship movement, contemporary worship as it's often called. Where did it come from? What's going on with it? How do we determine it when we see it? It's going to be a really interesting conversation. In the meantime, the Center for Worship Leadership will be releasing its next chapter in the Psalm Library. On Ash Wednesday, Psalm 130, Out of the Depths, will be dropping. I really encourage you to go on Spotify or subscribe to our YouTube channel to see the premiere of that resource. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.